Hello, this is Ames Gross, President of Pacific Bridge Medical, and thank you very much for attending our 2014 India Medical Device Regulatory Updates webcast today. We appreciate that. We're going to have about a 1-hour presentation, which will be followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. So if you have some questions, you can submit them through the chat function on your computer screen, and we'll try to address those at the end of the presentation. So I want to start the presentation on the second slide here, which is a picture of the Taj Mahal. So for people that like to go sightseeing, this is one of the most incredible sights you can see when you go to India. So the location is several hours outside of Delhi. If you happen to be in Delhi, you can go there for a one-day trip, and the sightseeing there is really quite amazing. I think Taj Mahal is one of the 7 wonders of the world. Getting to India now, the population 1.2 billion. People on the line probably realize that the Indian population will surpass the Chinese population, currently about 1.3 billion, by around 2022. And that's because in India you can have multiple children, and Indian families are normally fairly large. Whereas in China, up until recently, you could only have 1 child. Now you can have 2 children in China, but you have to pay some money for that and some other things. So still, the Indian population will surpass the Chinese population down the road. You can see some basic facts about Indian demographics. And keep in mind that, India, the per capita income per year is about $1,500 per year, $1,500, whereas that's about probably 25% of the per capita income in China, which is more like $6,000 per year today. So India is really poorer than China, and companies have to take that in consideration when they're looking at the marketplace there. So the market there, the medical device market, is growing very quickly in India, and currently the market size in India is around $4.5 billion, and it's expected to be about $12 billion by 2022. And keep in mind that in 2012, Indians spent an average of $64 annually on health care, compared to just $21 in 2002. So as the people in India get richer, the increased middle class, more people have money for health care and medical devices. And, U.S. and European companies that can provide high technology products, let's say like bioabsorbable stents or sophisticated diagnostic imaging equipment, should be able to do well in India. On the next slide, we talk here about the Indian medical device market. So there are some medical device manufacturers in India. There are actually about 200 decent-sized local manufacturers of medical devices in India, and out of the 200, maybe 25 of those Indian medical device manufacturers, about 25 of them are large companies. And today, in Indian market, the sophistication of the medical device markets has grown. So whereas 10 years ago they were making urine bags, gloves, and basic tubing, today some Indian manufacturers are able to make cardiac stents and also things like catheters, et cetera, a little more sophisticated Class 3 products. Of course, there's many multinationals already manufacturing in India, or multinationals that export from the West to India, including companies like Baxter, Boston Scientific, Smith & Nephew, Siemens, Philips, etc. Okay, on the next slide, we're going to talk about the market size. So I just mentioned 4.5 billion. So here we have 4.2 billion. So I think 4.5 is a better accurate number of the size of the market. And keep in mind that several years ago, the Indian government announced that all medical equipment would be subject to a uniform 5% basic customs duty and a 4% countervailing duty. Medical devices in India that are imported into India or exported from the West will also have a complete exemption from special additional duties. So in the past, if you were to export your medical devices to India, the duties to get into India were quite high. Those have been lowered significantly over the last 5 to 7 years. Now, when you look at the Indian healthcare market in the private sector, Most of the doctors are trained overseas or in India, and the private sector healthcare is quite good. The government sector, which is the public healthcare sector, is basically low quality and for people that don't have any money. So the majority of people in India still go to the public hospitals, but people that are getting richer and can afford it will go to a private hospital because the quality of the service, the products, the drugs, et cetera, are really a lot higher. And I'd say about 85% of the hospital costs arise from cardiology, oncology, infections, and maternity-type procedures. Now, there are many private insurance companies like Blue Cross or Sun Life have entered the Indian market over the last 10 years, and oftentimes these foreign insurance companies have set up joint ventures with local firms to increase their market share. There are also a variety of public sector insurance companies, such as the Employee State Insurance Corporation, the Life Insurance Corporation of India. There's a General Insurance Corporation, and the majority of the industrial labor force and their families in India are covered by the ESI, or the Employee State Insurance. So most people have fairly minimum insurance in India, and most people need to pay for procedures and products out of pocket, but there are some situations where reimbursement occurs. Now, here you see the medical device regulatory structure in India. You have the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and then below that you have the CDSCO, and the CDSCO has a medical device and diagnostic division. On the next slide, you can see the Indian medical device regulatory structure, and up until recently, Dr. Eswara Reddy was the Deputy Drug Controller of India, but recently Mr. Asim Sahu has taken over for Dr. Reddy and is now the Deputy Drug Controller of India. And you can see through the flowchart other groups in the Indian medical device regulatory structure. Now, regulation of medical devices. So we'd say here, generally the central government plays the leading role in the regulation of medical devices, while the state governments have a supporting role in India. So normally the regulatory responsibilities for the state governments, which would be under the State Drug Control Organization, are more limited to things like manufacturing, sale, and distribution of drugs and medical devices. But the DCGI has now the DCGI is the key group, is the key person in the CDSCO, and the DCGI has recently formulated 12 advisory committees of expert doctors, including in the fields of cardiology or orthopedics. And in each of these 12 advisory committees that the DCGI has formulated, there's about 10 doctors in each medical segment. And oftentimes these committees are more important than individuals, or what individuals might say about your device in the Indian medical device market. So still in India, medical devices are under the drug regulatory scheme. So there's not a separate medical device regulatory scheme in India right now. Most of it comes under the drug world. And you can see this when you're filling out a medical device registration document, because there'll still be questions on that device registration document that apply to drugs. And obviously, if there's a question about API or active pharmaceutical ingredients on the form to be filled out, it's not going to apply to medical devices. So since around 2006, actually, the Indian government has attempted to pass comprehensive medical device regulation. But this regulation has been sitting in a parliamentary standing committee that was supposed to submit its recommendations to the Parliament in December of 2013. But this comprehensive medical device regulation has not been implemented to date, and it's unclear when it will be implemented. So the proposed bill from India's MOH would include the following bullet points. And besides what's here, it's also going to introduce a 19-member central drug authority, or CDA, that would replace the CDSCO if the regulation was passed, and then the CDA, which would replace the CDSCO, would appoint medical device officers and oversee the licensing of all drugs, devices, and cosmetics manufactured in or sold in India. And also the new regulations talk about expanding the current drug consultation committee to become the Drugs, Cosmetic, and Medical Devices Consultative Committee to advise regulators and government and the Indian government. So if the proposed regulations were to be implemented, which they have not been, they outline some things that I think are important for you to be aware of. So the risk classification on the proposed regulations is divided into classes A, B, C, and D below. But right now, there's no classification for devices in India, so that's the main thing to keep in mind. Now, in the past, there was a list of specific regulated medical devices in India. So if you were on the list, if your product was on this specific regulated medical device list, then your product would need approval in India. So I think it was 2006, 2008, 2010, different specific medical devices were added to this list in India, which required product registration in India. So in general, though, we recommend that all high-risk devices be registered now before they are officially included in registration requirements in India. And it's probably easier to register high-risk devices now than later when the new regulations come out. So up until recently, the devices that required registration in India were specific devices found on this list here. Now, so what they did recently is basically it was a couple of years ago, the CDSCO replaced a list of individual devices requiring registration with a list of 14 product families or categories no longer listing individual items. So again, as of a couple of years ago, the CDSCO replaced the list of individual specific devices on the previous slide, which require registration, and they've now indicated 14 product families that require the registration. And you can see the 14 product families listed below. In addition, there's some additional families, medical device families, which are addressed in this slide too. Now, for IVDs in India, so basically IVD kits are categorized as notified diagnostic kits and non-notified diagnostic kits. So with respect to the notified diagnostic kits, this includes in vitro diagnostic devices for, let's say, HIV or hepatitis B or HCV, and also in vitro blood groupings. And so these notified diagnostic kits require manufacturing site and product registration in Form 41 and an import license on Form 10. We're going to talk about these forms a little later, but notified diagnostic kits require manufacturing site and product registration in India. Now, if you're a non-notified diagnostic kit, all other in vitro diagnostic kits or reagents are considered as non-notified, requiring only an import license in India today. So if you're in the non-notified diagnostic kits, you don't need to register the IVD kits in India. You just need to register the import license in Form 10. And we'll talk about that a little more too. Now, this is a chart with the current medical device registration process in India. On the left side, you can see medical devices without predicates. And then on the right side, you can see medical devices with predicates. So if you have a medical device without a predicate, you're going to go through Form 45 in India, and you may need to do local clinical studies for approximately 200 patients, and obviously you need to have post-marketing data for even a larger group, maybe 1,000 patients is common today in India. Now, on the right side, if you're a medical device with a predicate, you're going to register your product through Form 40, and normally the clinical trial reports, et cetera, from overseas are used, and you don't need to do local clinical trials in India for devices with predicates. And you can see in the middle there, we have the notified product families require registration with the DCGI. So we just talked about these notified product families in the previous slide. And then also, as you know, you need to have an authorized agent to do the registration in India. That could be an independent third party like Pacific Bridge Medical in our Delhi office, or it could be a distributor to be the independent agent in India to do the registration. And, of course, besides Form 40, there's some attachments to Form 40, which is D1 and D2, Schedules D1 and D2. Those have to be added also for the registration process. And you can see the path going down to get the registration certificate. Now, with regard to the process, again, companies must register regulated medical device in medical device families with the CDSCO before they can be, sold in the Indian marketplace. So in India, you need both a registration certificate and an import license are required before you can sell products in India. So you need both the registration certificate and you need to have an import license before products can be sold in India. And the guidelines were released at the end of 2012 to be effective from January in 2013, but there hasn't been much communication with respect to, updating these kind of requirements, et cetera. But in general, the DCGI and the industry in India adhere to these requirements of the product registration and the import license. Now, here we go a little more into the process. So again, to import products into the Indian market, you need to appoint an Indian agent, and the Indian agent has to have an approved wholesale marketing license, which can be obtained using Forms 20B and 21B. So again, the local Indian agent has to have an approved wholesale marketing license. Now, again, going through the process, so if your company is manufacturing your devices in India, you would need to use Form 28 to be approved from the government. But if you're not manufacturing in India and you just have to export the products, then you're going to basically work on Form 40. And Form 40 is using the CDSCO common document format, which are and guidelines which are posted on the CDSCO website. And after the receipt of the application with the fees, the evaluation will begin. And the DCGI may visit the manufacturing premises during the process. So in most cases, the DCGI is not going to visit overseas manufacturing facilities, but once in a while they will. And if the DCGI determines that they need to visit the factory overseas, they will normally charge a fee of about $5,000 to go to the foreign manufacturing facility. Again, more information on the process. So obviously you want to develop a medical device registration strategy, appoint an agent. You want to ask your agent for a detailed list of the required documents. You want to verify the list of documents against the DCGI check list related to your product. And then you obviously have to wait in turn. You have to provide clarifications to the questions generated by the DCGI during the review process. And then you have to wait for the approval. And in India, keep in mind, there are no official approval timelines are provided. So, in the U.S. or Japan or some other Asian countries, they'll give you a time frame when the clock starts, when the clock is going to end, but that is not the case in India. And the product registration of medical devices in India can take anywhere between 6 and 18 months if there are no clinical trials. But obviously, if there are clinical trials, you would need to add an additional year to the 6 to 18 months to get your product approved in India. Now, in the next slide, we go over some of the documents required for submission. So as I mentioned, several years ago, the CDSCO released guidelines for document submission for medical device product registration. And you can see some of the items that are required: a covering letter, The covering letter should specify whether the application for the registration of the manufacturing site is being submitted for the first time, or whether the application is for re-registration of a product, or in the covering letter you want to get the endorsement of additional products to an existing registration certificate, authorization letter, a completed Form 40. Form 40 is the main document, as we just discussed, power of attorney, and then also you need to complete Schedules D1 and D2. We have some examples of those in the next few pages. So additional documents required for the medical device submission would include things like the plant master file. Obviously, plant master file should contain information about the product and the control of the manufacturing process, at the manufacturing site. Also included in the PMF would be things like the location and layout of the premises, a flow chart of the people, details of the manufacturing process, etc. And also, so for each device issued by any of the GHTF member countries, U.S., Canada, Japan, a free sale certificate should state that the device to be registered is freely sold in its country of origin. And here again are some more things in the documents to be submitted. The following addition documents are required for notified diagnostic kits. So beyond what we said the last couple slides for devices, if you have diagnostic kits, you have to provide some additional information. And besides what's listed here, you may have to provide things like a specific batch test record for at least 3 competitive batches, showing the specification of each testing parameter, from the manufacturer. Or you may have to put a detailed test report of all the components used in the finished IVD kit. And while only 3 types of IVDs are notified and must go through the product registration, as I mentioned earlier, all IVDs, including the non-notified IVDs, will need to get an import license to be sold in India. Now, I just put a picture of some of the forms here so you can get a better sense of that and not be scared away. So on Form 40, the form states drugs as regulated medical devices are considered as drugs under the CDA. So you want to make sure that the name of the medical device stated in Form 40 is the same as that mentioned in your regulatory certificates. So again, the name and the consistency on Form 40. So Form 41 is the registration certificate you will receive from the government after the product is approved. So Form 40 is the application. Form 41 is the product approval. And so then the manufacturer or the Indian agent must tell the CDSCO of any action taken due to adverse reactions such as market withdrawal or regulatory restrictions, a substandard quality report from the regulatory authority of the country where the product is manufactured and sold, and also the manufacturer, Indian agent, must notify the CDSCO of any changes in the manufacturing process, packaging, labeling, testing, or documentation within 30 days. And then for major changes, re-registration may be required. And in that case, the CDSCO must be notified in writing of any change in the address of the manufacturing firm or factory or in the constitution of the firm. And, okay, so I think those cover the issues. So, again, like in most countries, after the product approval, you must be in touch with the CDSCO with regard to adverse events and other changes in the products, etc. Now here we're looking at Schedule D1, and the next page is D2. And again, as I mentioned, Schedule D1 and D2 are attached to Form 40 for the medical device registration. And we don't have 1.5 here. It goes to 1.4, but 1.5 is requiring a copy of the plant master file duly notarized. And then on 1.6, of a copy of the plant registration approval certificate issued by the Minister of Health or the National Regulatory Authority of the foreign country concerned. So there's a list of things you need to put onto the Schedule D1 for the registration too. Now, again, Schedule D2 is also attached to Form 40, And the information here is going to be some of the things you can see on the screen, but it could also include things like information regarding sterilization of the device, whether the device is sterile or non-sterile, and if it's sterile, what's the mode of sterilization. And you might also have things in Schedule D2, what's the regulatory status of similar devices in India? Are they approved or new devices too? Now, the registration fees for obtaining the registration certificate, again, Form 41, are listed below. So the original receipt of the payment is required to be submitted with the application for registration in India. And keep in mind that applicants paying in rupees need to make sure that the receipt clearly indicates the U.S. equivalent of the total fees. Please note that there may be a fee charged for the DCGI inspection of local manufacturing facilities too. This, however, if there's a fee for DCGI inspection of local Indian manufacturing facilities, this fee will not be as high as the DCGI fee of $5,000 for an overseas inspection. So these are the basic fees and the registration of a single medical device. So if you're registering 20 products, you're going to have $20,000 in medical device registration fees going to the DCGI. Now, if you have a totally new product, you're going to use Form 44. And Form 44 is required when the product is judged to be a new medical device and requires clinical trials in India. And keep in mind that this is because some of the medical devices are still classified as drugs and are therefore subject to some of the same regulations as drugs for new medical device registration. And for Form 44, committees are set up for specific product groups, and it may be beneficial to make a technical presentation to one of the specified product groups about your product. And, of course, after you make this kind of presentation for a new product, they're going to have many questions. So, again, you want to ask for a technical, you want to try to make a technical presentation to the appropriate committee. So Form 45 has several important conditions to keep in mind. On Form 45, there is a provision for post-marketing surveillance, which shall be conducted during the initial period of 2 years of marketing of the new product in India. And in addition, on Form 45 for new products, there's a periodic safety update report of new devices or drugs must be submitted to the DCGI every 6 months for the first 2 years and annually for the following 2 years too. And these periodic safety update reports need to be submitted within 30 calendar days of the last day of the reporting period. So more requirements for new products than existing products, especially with post-market surveillance. Now, if you have a new product, for the most part, India will accept foreign clinical data, but if you have a new product in India, then you may have to do a local clinical study. And again, so generally the clinical studies are only required for new medical devices. And several years ago, the CDSCO released a new draft guideline for the submission for conducting clinical trials of medical devices in India. And but these guidelines that were submitted several years ago are still not regulation yet. And keep in mind that all clinical trials in India need to be registered with the Clinical Trial Registry website under the National Institute of Medical Statistics. And then with regard to the required documents for submission to do conduct a clinical trial in India, those requirements are documented in Schedule Y. And the below information is some of the things that would be required on your submission, Schedule Y, to do a clinical study in India. in addition to some of the things we have listed here, you could have a case report record form, details of the previous clinical or preclinical studies, the reason why or the justification for conducting the trial in India, other technical documents, etc. So again, for the clinical trials, for devices, you have to follow the GCP requirements and also the requirements in Schedule Y, which I just mentioned. So for drugs, so there's no separate medical device clinical requirements now in India today. And, in the past, medical companies have conducted clinical trials in India because of the country's low cost, high number of patients that may have the disease, etc. But keep in mind that several years ago, or actually in late 2012, the DCA, the Drugs and Cosmetic Act, was amended with new regulations on the ethical supervision and regulation of clinical trials. And so securing permission for a clinical trial now in India is much more rigorous because some companies, especially in the drug world, were using sick Indian patients with certain diseases as guinea pigs without enough informed consent information, et cetera. So it's become more difficult to do clinical trials in India, but hopefully you don't have a new product which will require those in India today. Okay, now for the product re-registration, that's on Form 41. So again, Form 40 to get the registration certificate, the Form 40 to do the application for the product approval, and then Form 41 is the registration certificate approval. And the Form 41 is valid for 3 years from the date of issue. But keep in mind, if you're doing the re-registration, in general, we'd say that the application for the renewal of the registration certificate should be submitted no earlier than 9 months from the certificate expiration date. But what we say is after about 2 years and several months, you want to get your data together for the re-registration of your device in India. And again, the certificates are only valid for 3 years. So re-registration occurs more frequently in India than, let's say, some of the other Asian markets. So here we're talking about the re-registration of your medical device in India. And again, on the left here, we have the new products for Form 45, where there's no predicates in India, and what the re-registration challenges are. So again, for the new products, there'll be semi-annual device performance records that have to be submitted to the DCGI for covering a period of 2 years. And on the right column, in situations for the re-registration where the medical device is not a new device, basically you're going to work with your distributor or your local agent to do the re-registration. And the question there would be, are you, as mentioned in the right corner, bottom right corner, are your distributors knowledgeable on the regulatory requirements related to the post-market surveillance for device re-registration? So that we found that to be a big issue now, that distributors are not that knowledgeable or don't keep good records for re-registration in India and they don't have the post-market data to get the re-registration approvals. And you can see in the middle again, you're going to have to have an authorized Indian agent to do the re-registration. Attachment D2, which is attached to Form 40, has some requirements to include Indian post-market surveillance data too for re-registration. So the real question on the bottom there is, do you have the right PMS information to include in this section on D2 for the re-registration? And did you collate or did you gather all the complaints from your various Indian distributors so you have accurate post-market data to do the re-registration successfully in India? Now, product re-registration, if you're basically working off a Schedule D2, which talks about the post-market surveillance data which is required. So if you are applying for re-registration after 3 years of the product on the Indian market, today you have to provide product performance or PMS related data as detailed under sections 1.7 and 7.1 of Schedule D2. So if you get a copy of Schedule D2 and you look at the clauses for 1.7 and 7.1, you'll find the information below. So these days, the DCGI in India is really focused on sections 1.7 and 7.1 of Schedule D2 when you want to get a re-registration for your product. And so for Section 1.7 details the safety and the performance of the related information on the device, which you can see on the screen. And if the device contains any of the following descriptive information, it needs to be followed. So again, if you have animal or let's say human cell tissues or derivatives, these kind of things, you really have to keep this information. Also, products with cells, tissues, and derivatives of microbial recombinant origin is required, and also products with irradiating components or ionizing products would need to be mentioned here too. Now, besides Clause 1.7 on Schedule D2, there's another clause in Schedule D2 which is also reflective of the need for more post-market data. And this is in Clause 7.1. And so 7.1 on Schedule D2 for the product re-registration looks at post-marketing surveillance data and also vigilance reporting. So when you're going for your re-registration in India now, according to attachment or Schedule D2, if you look at clauses 7.1 and clauses 1.7, you can see an increased need for post-market data for re-registration of your product in India. Now, on the next slide, the thing is, if you're selling your products through a distributor in India, I would say in most cases the Indian distributors do not want to keep post-market surveillance data, because Indian distributors, their main goal is to sell your product and make a margin on those sales, and so that's how they're making their money. And in a situation, let's say an Indian doctor says there is a problem, normally what will happen is the Indian doctor was unlikely to buy the product again, or the distributor will just replace the product for free. So in general, I'd say that Indian distributors don't keep this post-market surveillance data for product re-registration. And as I mentioned, why will your Indian distributor keep post-market surveillance data if the doctor won't buy again, or if the doctor is happy with the replacement device that you provide because of the defect in the device you already sold? And I'd say that in general, almost all Indian distributors are not aware of Indian and global regulatory requirements for complaint handling and the quality of the information that's required to be collected. So again, almost all Indian distributors, from our experience, has been that they're not aware of Indian and global regulatory requirements for complaint handling and collection of information. So when you're doing the re-registration, it could be very difficult to get the PMS data from your Indian distributor because they're not keeping a copy of that. Now, on the next slide, as I mentioned, for re-registration, more and more post-market data is being required. And the medical device will be required to be withdrawn from sale from the market in case there's any undesirable reactions to like, say, a failure of the device or accessories. The DCGI should be informed of adverse events on the medical device, if any. So, as I mentioned, more and more re-registrations will require good post-market data. And then if you can't rely on your distributor to get you the PMS data you need for re-registration, we recommend that you utilize an outside third party. So, obviously, if you can't get re-registration, you can't sell the product on the market, and you can't make any money on those sales. And, of course, if you can't sell your product on the market because you don't have the PMS data to get the re-registration, your competitors are always going to say that you're an unreliable supplier and then take market share from your Indian business. And what we did to facilitate keeping better post-market data for companies, because the distributors oftentimes don't keep it, is we recently set up a call center to collect post-market data in India. So in other words, if there's an adverse event or whatever, the hospital or the doctor can call this toll-free number in our call center in India, and we'll keep good records of that post-market surveillance data so you can use it for your re-registration in India. So to give you a couple examples, we had a client that applied for re-registration. The CDSCO asked for the post-market surveillance data. So basically, in this case, there was no collection of post-market data, and there was no CAPA by the manufacturers for such complaints. And the result of this situation was the products weren't registered. They weren't re-registered, so of course the products could not be sold in India. And what I put here is a couple examples. This is a letter from the CDSCO indicating, with regard to their re-registration, that the case has been examined in light of the documents you submitted, and we request that you submit the following documents clarification to this office in order for us to do the re-registration. So original labels and package inserts, duly notarized copy of conformity of the product, and you can see our complete summary of the PMS data during the validity of the registration certificate, as well as the summary of the procedures in place for post-market surveillance data. So again, the DCGI at the CDSCO is now asking for more post-market data with regard to re-registration in India. Also, keep in mind that for your U.S. or European approvals, you need to gather post-market data globally, right? So in the U.S., the medical device reporting, or the MDR form, is Form 3500, and in EU, the CE MedDev document is 2.12-1, which is the Device Vigilance System regulations for incidents, and the report form for Europe. So, if your distributor or your company in India, your own office there, isn't collecting the right post-market data from India, it's likely in the U.S. or Europe, in the U.S. you could get a 483. And if you get a 483 from the U.S. FDA, obviously this could lead to closing of your manufacturing plant and reduce the sales and create an administrative nightmare. So the post-marketing data in India is now more and more of it's being required for re-registration of devices in India, but also for U.S. and European reporting. If you don't have good post-market data from India, that could screw you up in the U.S. or Europe. So what you want to do is be proactive here, and you don't want to wait until you have you do not have the data, and there's a big problem. So I think big companies especially are vulnerable for having this post-market data for re-registration of their products, and big companies obviously have more money, so the Indian government is going to normally go after big companies that have more money to pay in fees to keep their Indian business alive. Now, as I mentioned, besides the product registration in India, you need to get an import license to get your product into the Indian market for sale. And so this goes again on the left side: medical devices without predicates, medical devices with predicates, and I think the chart is fairly self-explanatory. But you can see on the bottom left hand, and only the Indian agent or the registration certificate holder can apply for import license and obtain approval on Form 10, and then each individual distributor in India can apply for import licenses and obtain multiple Form 10s independently. So you want to study this chart to get the import registration. And then we're going through, obviously, after obtaining the registration certificate, you need to get the import license, and the importer can apply for an import license from the DCGI. And several years ago, the CDSCO released new guidelines for document submission to obtain an import license for medical devices in India. And some of the documents that are required for the import license are outlined below. So here you can see for the import license, Form 8 states the drugs, although we're dealing with medical devices here, that the manufacturing company or the Indian agent, we are authorizing you to get an import license. So Form 8 is the application to get an import license. And then on the next slide, Form 9 states, again, drugs, but is regulated as medical devices. Form 9 is actually is attached to the application of Form 8 for the import license. So you can get a sense of Form 9 attached to Form 8 to get your import license. And then once you get approval for the import license in India, the import license, or you get Form 10, and the import license is valid for 3 years, similar to the product registration, which is also valid for 3 years. And again, if you're trying to get an import license renewal, the application for renewal import license must be submitted no earlier than 3 months from the license expiration date. So again, after 2 years in India on the market, you really need to do the re-registration, 2 years and 3 months into the process. You need to make sure you have good post-market surveillance data for the re-registration, and also you need to re-register for your import license. And again, we're recommending that you start early on getting the renewal for the import license. Now, on the next slide, you can see on Form 10 here, again, Form 10 is what you'll get back from the Indian government for the import license and the conditions of an import license. You normally have to have a photocopy displayed on the premises of the distributor or the company that's selling the products. Each imported product batch must have a detailed records and also testing certificates that are dated and signed by the manufacturers. These are also subject to examination and testing in India. And if the firm that's selling the product, if the constitution of that company changes, it has basically 3 months in which to get a new import license. So again, some of the requirements for Form 10 and getting the import license. Now, of course, just like the product registration fees, there's government fees for the import license fees for getting Form 10. But keep in mind, again, if the manufacturing facility of these products is outside of India, which in most cases is the situation, there may be an additional charge of $5,000 plus travel expenses, as I mentioned before, for the government officials to make an overseas inspection. And so in certain cases, to get the import license, there'll be an overseas inspection, which could cost the manufacturer some money. Now here, we're talking about expediting import license approval. Obviously, you need to select the right agent. The importer is very important. Hopefully that agent or importer has some kind of way to keep the post-market surveillance data, which is required for re-registration. And also an agent importer must have, it's best if they have some experience with Western companies, an office or, some presence in Delhi, because for the registration or the import license, you need to spend substantial time in New Delhi to follow up on your application, deal with the DCGI government officials, and, these kind of things. So on the next slide, in general, if you have a new product, it's best not to be the first applicant, and it's easier to get the approvals for the import license if subsequent applications can be used as precedents. So for fast tracking, you can get an endorsement letter from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, or government hospitals, or the Indian Council of Medical Research, which might help you with fast tracking of your product in India today. So again, if you don't have your own subsidiary located in India, or a branch office or joint venture in India, you need to appoint a local agent, or the local agent could be your importer. Again, the local agent could be the importer or an independent third party, like our office in India. and obviously the local agent needs to hold an IE code certificate to help you get the imports into India, and obviously the main focus of the agent is to represent you with the government in India with regulatory issues. So basically the importer's responsibilities or the local agent's responsibilities include maintaining detailed records of the sales, adverse events, and post-market data. Also the local agent needs to permit inspectors to enter your premises for the local agent and take samples if required. Again, the local agent has to be responsible for not selling any items or batches on the Indian market if they're not cleared already through the Indian government. Now, labeling and packaging. So as of now, the labeling is in English, although there is a proposal in the government now to have dual language labels with some Indian languages too. The label must be in ink and contain things like the trade name and the proper name of the device. Also things like the weight, the volume, and number of units. If there's any active ingredients or components of interest. Obviously, on the label, you have to have the name and the address of the manufacturer, and the address needs to be where the product is manufactured. And then normally you have a batch or manufacturing license numbers if the product is made in India. So here's some more information on the labeling and packaging. So it's normally the Standards of Weights and Measurement Act, which specifies the location and size of the label on the outside of the big box. So on the outside of the big box, the Standards of Weights and Measurements Act tells you how this needs to look. And on the outside of the big box, obviously, has the importer's data, importer's details, or the local agent's details. Then inside the big box, you may have your products individually wrapped. And normally, for the labeling of the individually wrapped products in the bigger box, you need to provide an 800 or toll-free telephone number for reporting the consumer complaints related to the product, etc. And again, the distributor may provide an 800 number, but what we found is that they normally don't keep good post-market data, which is on the labels for the individually wrapped boxes in the bigger box. So what normally happens is for the re-registration, the manufacturer has to make a declaration to the Indian government that there are no complaints and there's no problems with the products that have been sold in India. But of course, without your distributor collecting this post-market data, the manufacturer is open to problems because what may happen is there are some problems in India, nobody's collected the data, and then the foreign manufacturer has to make a direct declaration that there hasn't been any problems when there may have been problems, and this could cause you serious problems going for the re-registration again. So here are some more labeling requirements. For imported devices, labeling as per the GHTF guidelines or ISO specifications would usually be accepted, similar to the U.S. or EU. However, keep in mind if there's a variation from the essential requirements per the DCGI guidelines, it needs to be examined on a case-by-case basis. And of course, the labels need to be submitted for registration and also for re-registration in India. So here we have a couple slides that are showing you what the outer carton might look like for a shipment to India. So the IE code is the import-export code given by the Indian government to each importing business owner. And then it's very important on the bottom right, you can see for complaints, contact phone number. So again, normally an 800 number will be provided. The question is, when they call the 800 number, if any post-market data is really kept. Now, on the inside box or the inside package, you can repeat the details on the outer carton as mentioned here below. So you can see it's very similar. Now, some recent changes. There's some new labeling requirements under the standard of weights and measures, which require the 1-800 number for complaint reporting. But again, it's best to have a local Indian number is better than having an 800 number overseas, so the data can be collected accurately in India. And then again, you have to make sure that your distributor or your complaint handling toll-free service provider is knowledgeable about Indian regulations. And again, this information can be used for the post-market surveillance report information, as well as for renewal and global data, which needs to be submitted, let's say, to the U.S. or Europe. So on Form 40, which is the application for the approval Form 41, there's also a reporting requirement. And on Form 41, it says a manufacturer or his agent in India should from time to time report the global complaint status or any market recalls or, let's say, regulatory decisions or adverse events that may lead to a market withdrawal. And so that's on Form 41. And again, we talked about on the D2, which is attached to Form 40. Again, you have sections 1.7 and 7.1 talking about the collection of post-market surveillance data for product registration. And, again, the key question is under section 1.7 or 7.1 on D2 is, do you have the post-market data that's required for the re-registration? And keep in mind that the medical device guidelines are now being more strictly implemented in India since, I'd say, around 2013. So again, we recommend that you be careful with the data for the re-registration. Now, Form 40 also describes, in Form 40 you also have the description of the quality assurance, the self-inspection, quality audits, and quality control system requirements. And some of these quality assurance requirements are also in some proposed Schedule M regulations, which haven't come into effect yet. But Form 40 describes the quality assurance and quality audits and quality control systems of your products. And you can see here, GMP, GLP, GCP. On the bottom, the quality control system. Coverage should include things like sampling, specifications, testing, release procedures, and things of that nature. So keep in mind, as a pilot project in 2011, a team of CDSCO officials went from India to China for the inspection of 3 factories, and they also planned, I think, an inspection of a facility in Italy. So I think there will be more overseas audits done by the CDSCO going forward in India, so you want to be prepared for that likelihood. And the next few slides, I just wanted to show you what the hospitals look in India, and you can see the buildings look quite nice. This is a public hospital that's listed in Hyderabad, and the next situation is a hospital in Mumbai, which is a private hospital. So you can see the facilities compared especially to the buildings around there are pretty good. Now, the next 3 slides talk about obtaining a manufacturing license for your medical device if you manufacture your products in India. So I think these slides are fairly self-explanatory on 66, 67, and 68. You can see on 67 and 68 the documents that are required to get a manufacturing license to manufacture your medical device in India. And besides these things listed on slide 68, like on the bottom device master file, you also have to provide an ISO 13485 2000 certificate if you have that, a full quality assurance certificate, things like a declaration of conformity, and obviously approvals from U.S. or Europe would be also required and helpful for getting your manufacturing license in India. So that's going to be about a 1-hour presentation, conclude my formal presentation on India today. We appreciate your participation. We will send out an evaluation form after the webcast to better understand if this information is helpful for you in your Indian business, and also if you would like us to provide some webcasts on other topics in Asia going forward. Now what I'm going to do is take a sip of water, and we're going to go to the Q&A section. We actually already have quite a few questions that have been submitted, so let me start with those in a second. So the first question says, when registering a product, if you don't hear back for a long time from the DCGI after submitting your applications, what should you do? So as we mentioned that there's no approval time in India. Normally the application approvals are 6 to 18 months if no clinical trials are required to be done in India. So the question again, when registering a product, if you don't hear back from the DCGI after submitting your application, what should you do? Well, that's a good question. Well, as I mentioned, there's no official timelines are provided. But what I could say is if the applicant for device registration does not hear back from the DCGI for, let's say, 9 or 10 months after the submission has been made, in India, I think it's Rule 27A, you can submit a grievance application to the DCGI, and in some cases that may help give you a little more feedback on when you can expect the registration to be completed in India. Okay, the second question is, what products would likely require clinical trials by the DCGI for product registration? And if they are required, how long will this take? So again, the question is, what products would likely require clinical trials by the DCGI for product registration in India? And if local clinical trials are required, how long will this take? Well, I think as I mentioned during the presentation, normally local clinical trials in India are not required for product registration. In most cases, they can use foreign clinical data. But for new products, local clinical trials may be required. So I'd say that also foreign manufactured new medical devices which have no precedent or similar registered product in the Indian market, or products, let's say drug-eluting stents with new coatings or things like that, those products will require local clinical trials in India going forward. So again, foreign manufactured medical devices which have no precedent or a similar registered product in the Indian market are the ones that are most likely to require local clinical studies for product approval in India. And again, if you have to do local clinical studies in India, you want to count on about 1 year to do the local clinical trials in India. So the next question is, how many patients are necessary for clinical trials in India if you have to do a local clinical trial? So how many patients are required if you need to do a local clinical trial in India? Well, I'd say that for all new devices, which are the ones that require the local clinical trials in India, especially things with drug coatings, etc., normally I think it's about 200 patients are required to do a local clinical study in India, so 200 patients. Next question. What if you are applying for an import license and you have two different manufacturing plants located in different places but making the same device? What if you are applying for an import license and you have two different manufacturing plants located in different places but making the same device? Can you just apply for one import license, or do you need to get import licenses for both plants? But I guess the answer to that is, if you're importing from a single manufacturer which has two or more factories, that are located in different locations, even if they're making the same device, I think you need a separate import license for each of those factory licenses. So again, if you are making the same product in two different geographic locations, you will need to get two import licenses for each factory location. Okay, next question. What strategy should my company employ when considering what products to export to India if we sell high-end products? How can we have high sales? What strategy should my company employ when considering what products to export to India if we sell high-end priced products? Well, obviously there's some people that go to private hospitals in India and have lots of money, and the key there would be to improve the technology and the patient benefits, to stay ahead of local competitors. But I'd say in general, India as well as other emerging markets, there's a higher demand for products with less bells and whistles or less features that are oftentimes sold in the West. So, you may sell a product in the West that is product A with features 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you may sell the product in the developing market or in India for product A with only features 1, 2, and not features 3, 4. So a lot of companies now are making products with less bells and whistles for the developing market, and those are the ones that will probably do the best in developing market. And another thing you want to do is continually give doctor training on your products when you're in India. I know that GE announced that it was setting up some manufacturing facilities in India for EKG units or ultrasound machines to make lower priced, less featured products to sell in places like Asia, like Africa or Latin America. And I think also GE set up some kind of four-category pricing structure for its products depending on the features. So if you have a high-priced product in India, you can sell probably to the private hospitals with people that have money, but for the masses, you probably have to come up with a product line B instead of just having a product line A. Next question. When searching for a distributor in India, what should we take into account? When searching for a distributor in India, what should we take into account? Well, obviously, you want to be very careful about signing up an Indian distributor. And, the really good distributors in India are in pretty high demand since there's a shortage of what I'd say excellent distributors are. And obviously, with Indian distributors, you want to make sure the distribution agreement is well documented. In general, I wouldn't let Indian distributors decide on pricing in a distribution agreement. Sales targets should be realistic. Sometimes we found that Indian distributors commit to high targets but really can't deliver those. And for companies looking to find Indian distributors, we also published a report on Indian medical device distributors, manufacturers, and suppliers. You can look at our website, Pacific Ridge Medical, to obtain a copy of that. Okay, so let's look at some more questions here. How do you define a predicate device? Well, a predicate device is going to be very similar to a product that's already registered, obviously. New device registration. The question says, does clinical trial data from foreign countries are acceptable if a good number of Indian patients are part of the trial? So for a new device to be registered in India, if you have overseas foreign clinical data and some of the foreign clinical data is with Indian patients, is that going to help you? Well, I'd say probably not. If you have a new medical device, you'll need to do local clinical trials in India, not just having Indian patients from overseas trials. There's a question here. Are there annual product review requirements for medical devices? Are there annual product review requirements for medical devices in India? I'm not aware of that, but I'm not sure about the answer, so I'm sorry about that. Next question here is, Does a foreign manufacturer need to be registered by the Indian authorities? Yes, obviously foreign manufacturers do need to be registered. How do I know if my medical device needs registration in India? Is there a product classification procedure or else? So we went through already on the webcast today the families of the different types of products that would require registration in India. And I also mentioned if you have a risky product, I would recommend registering that as soon as possible too. So again, is your product in the registration families that we talked about during the webcast? Okay. Is there a database for products that have been registered to determine if a product is new or not? Well, I guess I'm not sure there's a database, but I think what you have to do, obviously, is just look at your new product and see if there's anything like that that's already been registered in India. And obviously, if not, it's going to be considered a new product. All right, the next question. Okay, the question is, as the Indian healthcare sector is dominated by the private sector, well, that's for the rich people, are there regulations that govern the standards of these private healthcare institutions in terms of pricing of medical equipment, service to the patients, etc.? So again, the question is, as the Indian healthcare sector is dominated by the private sector, are there regulations that govern the standards of these private healthcare institutions in terms of pricing of medical equipment to, I guess, private sector hospitals? Well, I guess I'd say that, although the private medical hospitals are widely perceived as superior to their public or government counterparts, the private system is not without its own problems. Accountability and quality control in private hospitals can still be a concern in India. I think it was several years ago the Indian government established a Clinical Establishment Act to overcome the issues of malpractice in private hospitals. And if I remember correctly, the act applies to all public and privately owned medical institutions involved, in the diagnostic and treatment of diseases in hospitals. So I do remember several years ago there was some kind of a Clinical Establishment Act which deals with malpractice in the private healthcare sector. Next question. What are some of the business etiquette rules in India that a foreign company should know, especially when dealing with the Indian government? Well, obviously, when you're dealing in any of the Asian markets, including India, you need to know about the country, the culture, what's accepted and what's not accepted. So from a business etiquette standpoint, I'd probably make the following comments. Normally, I would use the titles of the Indian counterpart, professor or doctor, if they have one. If they don't have it, I'd still use, Mr. or Miss or Miss by their last names. I wouldn't call them by their first names. In general, I would try not to appear too aggressive in business negotiations for product registration. This may be considered a sign of disrespect. Again, like if you're sitting with some government officials and they offer tea, not taking the tea, I guess it would be sort of a, if you refuse to have some tea, it could be upsetting to the Indian counterpart. So also, I guess you want to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, with the product registration timetable, the concept of time is less important, I'd say, in India to the Indian government. And in general, the Indian government is under no time pressure, whereas you, as a product registration professional, are under time pressure. So that's some of the things that you want to keep in mind. You just want to make sure the dossier, when you go to the Indian government, is as clean as it can be, so that you can. It's so simple for the Indian regulators to approve the process. Next question here. Please confirm PMS post-market surveillance requirements include both complaint investigations and vigilance reporting. So that's true. it says, during the discussion on slide 61, it was mentioned that requirements were implemented in 2013. So, however, the detail covered in the presentation focused on complaints, adverse events, little said of the vigilance requirements. No, vigilance requirements are also key for PMS data in India too. So the next question says, what is the format for expiration dating date of manufacture? Does it comply with the new FDI UDI regs? So yeah, I would say that the format for the expiration data of manufacture, et cetera, is, yeah, it's like the FDA UDI regs. Next question. A registration application of its own application of its own manufacturing plant must be submitted also by foreign manufacturers. Yeah, I mean, one of the registration requirement is to provide, plant master file information, et cetera. So that is required for product registration. Next question says, what are the biggest mistakes to avoid when registering a medical device in India? Based on your personal experience, what do you suggest? So again, the question says, what are the biggest mistakes to avoid when registering a medical device in India? Well, I mean, obviously, if you're going to register a product in India, you want to be very familiar with the regulatory process, the documents required, et cetera. And, it's obviously imperative that your distributors or your local agents have a really good knowledge of the regulatory issues in India. So, I mean, obviously, good planning is always needed when registering a device in India or any other markets. And again, you want to check to see if your product's regulated under one of the families we described in the registration, that kind of thing. What are the biggest mistakes? I'd say that there have been some instances where registration processes in India were delayed, primarily due to an applicant's incomplete document submission, or let's say if the application information is inaccurate. Things like names or addresses of the legal manufacturer, they're not mentioned in Form 40 correctly. Sometimes a few medical devices were registered together as a single device, but actually they were different types of devices, so this can slow down the registration process in India. If you don't pay the amount that's required for the registration, that's going to slow down or cease the evaluation of your device in India. Also, I'd say that sometimes the processes in India were delayed because notarized certificates were submitted as photocopies or scanned copies instead of the originals. So these could be reasons for delay in getting the approval. The next question says, how long does it take to get an import license in India? How long does it take to get the import license in India? Well, I would say in general, 2 to 3 months if your documentation for the import license is fulfilled, similar to what we talked about in the presentation today. So again, first you have to get the registration approval of the product, and that could take 6 to 18 months, as I mentioned, and then I'd say about 2 to 3 months for the import license approval, which is also required to get your product into India. I've heard that it's important to have only verbal communications with the DCGI and not put anything in writing. What is the reason for that? I've heard that it's better to have, face-to-face discussions or verbal communication with the DCGI instead of putting anything in writing. Well, I think that's accurate. I think it's probably better to speak verbally with the DCGI members for clarification issues before submitting your formal application. And normally if you put something in writing, we found that the government will normally give you very conservative replies. And keep in mind, if you get a negative written response from the DCGI, it's going to really be difficult to overturn that or or change that. So in general, I would agree that yes, it's best to discuss issues verbally with the DCGI people beforehand, and that personal representation is always better than submitting written documents that may or not be approved and will be hard to change later on if you've submitted something formally in writing. Next question is, how long does it take to get a manufacturing license in India? So I guess if you want to manufacture locally, how long would that take? Well, I think to get a manufacturing license for making a medical device in India takes about a year. And on the last 3 slides of the presentation, we talked about some of the requirements to get a manufacturing license in India. But again, you're going to have to be prepared to spend significant amount of time with the CDSCO to get your manufacturing license. And again, sometimes this is due to oftentimes a lack of people to approve the manufacturing license, and this can make the government processing less efficient. So I'd say to get a manufacturing license, normally about 1 year. Let's see what the next question is. Would a novel device with a CE mark in Europe, which does not have a similar counterpart or predicate in India, and is not listed as a regulated device in one of the regulatory categories, be considered a newer device? Would it also require a longer registration process? So would a novel device with a CE mark in Europe, which does not have a similar counterpart or predicate in India, is not listed as one of the regulated medical device families, be considered a new device? Well, it's a tricky question. I'd say it's a gray area. If it's a newly designed product, it's probably going to be construed as a new device in India. However, if it's not classified as a device that requires registration in India, then it may be outside the purview of the regulations. So I'd say it's sort of a gray area. It's hard to comment in general. Okay, next questions. We have time for a few more here. Many ministries of health allow for a grace period to implement PMS requirements. Is this the case in India? Well, as I mentioned, I think for the re-registration of products, having the PMS data is crucial. And are they going to give you a grace period? That's probably a case-by-case situation. If you have a good reason to have a grace period for collecting the PMS data, I guess it's possible. But what we really recommend is that you keep good post-market surveillance data during the time the product's registered, so you can use that data for the reimbursement. We seem to have a couple more questions here. Let's see. To manufacture medical devices in India, there was a list of documents in the presentation required for the application. Are there other licenses necessary to manufacture devices in India besides a manufacturing license? So to manufacture medical devices in India, there was a list of documents in the presentation. So in the last 3 slides, I talked about these are the manufacturing requirements if you want to make your device in India. Are there other licenses necessary to manufacture devices in India besides a manufacturing license? That's a good question. Let's see. I'd say, that there are other licenses that are required for manufacturing of a medical device in India, but those are normally at the state and the local level, levels. And there's things like at the state and local level, a license for capital goods to import capital goods, or license for raw materials. There's also labor law restrictions, et cetera. So these are other things you want to keep in mind if you're setting up a manufacturing facility in India. But again, the main license is the manufacturing license, but there may be also some state and local requirements too that would be important. The next question says, would a warning letter of the manufacturing site issued by the U.S. FDA affect the registration of a device in India? Would a warning letter of the manufacturing site issued by the U.S. FDA affect the registration of a device in India? I'd say generally yes, that if you have a warning letter on your facility in the U.S. and you have it's acknowledged by the U.S. FDA, that could hold up a registration of your product in India. So you want to be careful about that. Okay, let's see here. I'm sorry I can't answer all these questions, but I'm trying to answer the ones that I can here. Let's see. Okay. It says, when applying for manufacturing a medical device in India, what does an inspection for compliance by authorities consist of? So when you're applying for a license to manufacture devices in India, what does an inspection for compliance by the authorities consist of? Is it just for GMP compliance? Is it just for GMP compliance? I think the answer to that is yes, and it is just for GMP compliance. So I think essentially the Indian authorities will be checking to make sure there are no mistakes are made in the production. There's no cross-contamination or inadequate safety procedures, etc. Next question. Okay, let's see. Is there any reason why a renewal application should not be submitted earlier than 9 months from the expiration date? Is there any reason why a renewal application should not be submitted earlier than 9 months? Well, I think during the presentation I mentioned after 2 years and several months you want to start to do your renewal application. I think the 9-month specification is in relation to the registration certificate in Form 41. I'd say that in general it takes maybe 6 to 9 months to process the re-registration. I'm really not sure about that question, whether it requires 9 months or not. So I would just say you want to get your re-registration dossier submitted, maybe 6 months, 3 to 6 months before it expires, and you want to start the process maybe 9 months before the current registration expires. Okay, well, that'll do it for today's webcast. We run out of time. Thank you very much for attending. We will be sending out an evaluation form. We appreciate your comments. Again, this is Ames Gross. I'm the president of Pacific Ridge Medical, and thank you for attending our Indian webcast today. And we look forward to having you attend another one of our Asian webcasts in the future. Thanks again, and have a nice day. The webcast is now over. Goodbye.